David Cole is in the hotel lobby. The lobby gleamed with polished marble floors, chandeliers dripping light like liquid gold, and a faint scent of lavender drifting through the air vents. It was the kind of hotel where every surface whispered money, and every glance judged whether you belonged. And in that grand silence, a man walked in. No entourage, no luggage cart trailing behind him, no flashy designer watch glinting at his wrist, just a tall black man in a tailored but understated navy suit, worn shoes polished enough to show he cared, but not flashy enough to announce wealth. His name was David Cole. To the world outside, he was another face in the crowd. But in boardrooms, across the country, his signature was the difference between jobs created and jobs lost. He was a CEO who had quietly built an empire beneath the radar of those too arrogant to notice. The front desk clerk looked up, her smile practiced, but her eyes narrowing as they swept over him. A whisper passed to the bellboy. A security guard shifted his weight. The air grew colder, heavier, as if invisible walls rose around him. David paused, his eyes drifting across the chandeliers, the glistening marble, the staff lined up like guardians of wealth. He wasn't looking for trouble. He had come for a quiet afternoon meeting in one of the hotel's private lounges. But already, he felt the weight of eyes on his skin, eyes that saw his color first and his humanity last. "Excuse me, sir," the clerk finally said, her voice polite but sharp at the edges. "This area is for guests only. Can I help you find your way?" Behind him, a couple in designer coats breezed past without a question. David's jaw tightened. He gave the woman his calmest smile. "Yes," he replied, "I believe you can." But she never let him finish. Within minutes, the whispers grew into action, the suspicion hardened into command, and the humiliation began. What? They didn't know, what not a single person in that glittering lobby realized, was that this man they were dismissing like an intruder had the power to flip their entire world upside down. And he was about to do it without raising his voice. David Cole hands over a document. David Cole had walked into countless lobbies before. Airports, courthouses, government halls. He had never needed to announce who he was. His presence alone, tall, calm, and sharply intelligent, usually commanded quiet respect. But here, in this marble palace of privilege, his presence was treated like a stain on the glass. The clerk's eyes darted up and down his suit once more, her lips tightening as if she were holding back a sneer. "Sir, as I said, this is a private establishment. The lobby is reserved for registered guests and members." "I am a guest," David said evenly, sliding a reservation confirmation across the counter. He had booked the private executive lounge for his meeting. The name on the reservation, Cole Enterprises, sat printed in bold letters. The woman barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "We'll need identification." David reached for his wallet, but before he could produce it, a man in a pressed black suit approached. The hotel's floor manager. His stride was sharp, his eyes filled with suspicion rather than courtesy. "Is there a problem here?" The clerk didn't hesitate. "This gentleman insists he has a booking. But—" She leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not enough. "I don't think this is accurate." David heard it clearly. The hesitation, the unspoken word. Someone like him. The manager's gaze hardened. "Sir, may I ask what business you have here? This hotel isn't open for tours. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere local?" David's stomach clenched. He knew that phrase. Somewhere local. A polite dagger, cloaked in customer service. Translation: "Go back where you came from. You don't belong here." Still, he remained calm. I have a meeting in your executive lounge at 3 o'clock. My assistant made the booking under my company's name. Company? The manager said, as though the word didn't fit. His eyes swept David up and down again, as if searching for cracks in the lie. And what company is that? David folded his hands on the counter. Cole Enterprises. The name hung in the air. The manager blinked. The clerk frowned. Neither recognized it. That was expected. David had built his business to be powerful, not loud. But what struck him was the smirk that followed. Cole Enterprises? The manager let out a chuckle that made the bellboy laugh nervously behind him. I see. Well, Mr. Cole, unfortunately, we're unable to verify your claim. Perhaps if you had booked through a different channel. David inhaled slowly. This wasn't about a booking. This was about him, his skin, his presence, his quiet refusal to play the part they had already assigned him. Sir, David said, his voice lowering but steady, you are mistaken. However, he wasn't allowed to say another word. Guards escorted David out. The manager raised his hand and snapped his fingers. 2 security guards stepped forward, big men with earpieces and heavy shoulders. Escort him out, please, the manager ordered casually, as if brushing lint off his jacket. This establishment has a certain standard, and we cannot make exceptions. David stood still, feeling the heat of every pair of eyes in the lobby. The couple in designer coats had stopped at the elevators to watch. A group of businessmen seated in the lounge glanced up from their laptops. Even the bellboy seemed eager to see how quickly the intruder would be thrown out. The guards flanked him. One gestured to the glass doors. This way, sir. David could have resisted. He could have raised his voice, demanded to see the general manager, thrown down the weight of his real title right then and there. But something in him, something sharpened over years of being underestimated, told him to wait. So, he picked up his leather briefcase, gave the manager a long, unreadable look, and allowed himself to be escorted outside. David Cole stands on the steps. The lobby doors closed behind him with a hiss, and the warm fragrance of lavender was replaced with the sharp bite of city air. David stood on the steps of the luxury hotel, his reflection caught in the polished glass behind him. Inside, he could still see the smirking manager return to his counter, brushing off the encounter like a minor inconvenience. The clerk laughed softly. The guards adjusted their cuffs and returned to their posts. To them, the issue has been resolved. 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 The man who didn't belong had been removed. But David's jaw tightened. His chest rose and fell slowly. And behind his calm eyes, his mind was already moving. They think they've closed a door on me, he thought. But they've just opened the biggest one yet. Because what the staff inside did not realize was simple. This hotel, this chain, this brand that prided itself on wealth, exclusivity, and power was owned, quietly but completely, by him. And the humiliation he had just endured would not vanish into silence. No. It would echo through every corner of this establishment, louder than the chandeliers could ever shine. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was patient, calculated. But for the first time in years, David Cole decided he would show his power not in contracts and balance sheets, but right there, on the marble floors of their so-called untouchable empire. And when he walked back through those doors, nothing would be the same again. The city outside the glass doors was alive with noise, horns blaring, footsteps clattering, a street vendor shouting about fresh pretzels. But David barely heard any of it. He stood there for a long moment, one hand on the railing, the other gripping his briefcase, steadying himself against the sting of humiliation still burning his chest. The wind tugged at his suit jacket, reminding him of the chill in the air. But the greater chill had come from inside, from the way eyes had measured him, stripped him, and dismissed him before he could speak a full sentence. He had been in that lobby for less than 10 minutes, and yet those minutes had stretched into something heavier than an hour. The glances, the whispers, the mocking smirk on the manager's face. He replayed the scene in his mind. The clerk's voice, sharp and falsely polite. "Can I help you find your way?" The manager's suggestion. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere local." The way the guards had flanked him, treating him not as a client, but as a trespasser. David took a deep breath. He had built his life around patience and strategy. But patience did not erase the sting of disrespect. He remembered suddenly being 12 years old and following his mother into a store back in Atlanta. She had worked 2 jobs, cleaned offices at night, raised him with unshakable dignity. And yet, he remembered how a store clerk had trailed behind them in every aisle, pretending to straighten shelves, but really watching for theft. His mother had held her head high, ignoring the suspicion. But when they left the store, he had asked her why. Why didn't she say something? Why didn't she fight? She had placed her hands on his small shoulders and said softly, "Because sometimes, baby, the loudest fight is to keep walking." But one day, when you have power, you won't just walk. You'll stand. And today, that day had come. David turned back toward the glass doors, watching the reflection of chandeliers shimmering inside. The guards had resumed their positions, their faces blank, their eyes occasionally flicking toward him as if expecting him to cause trouble. To them, the problem had been solved. To them, he was gone. But David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his thumb hovering over the screen. His assistant, Carla, had texted, "Carla, conference team just arrived. Ready for the lounge?" David smirked faintly. The irony was too sharp to ignore. The team was already here, and the staff inside had no idea they had just thrown out the E-type man who signed their checks, who funded their pay, who owned the very system beneath their polished shoes. He typed back a short reply. "David, wait outside. We'll handle this differently." Sliding his phone back into his pocket, he straightened, his jacket, his mind sharpening with each passing second. He would not storm back inside in anger. That would be expected. That would be the stereotype they were silently waiting to confirm. Instead, he would return with silence, with presence, with truth revealed in the plainest, most devastating way. He started walking down the steps, past a limousine parked at the curb. The driver stepped out quickly and opened the door, bowing his head. "Mr. Cole," the driver greeted. "Shall I take you to the alternate venue?" David shook his head. His voice was calm but edged with steel. "No, we're not leaving. We're going back in. But not yet." The driver hesitated, then nodded. "As you wish, sir." David leaned against the car for a moment, his gaze steady on the grand entrance. The chandeliers inside cast warm light onto the marble floor, making the place look like a palace. He studied it, every detail imprinted in his mind. The high ceilings, the velvet chairs, the pristine reception desk. It was all designed to exude wealth and superiority. But he knew the truth. The wealth wasn't theirs. The superiority wasn't real. Inside, he imagined the staff laughing softly, congratulating themselves for keeping their standards. He imagined the smugness in their voices as they gossiped about the man who thought he belonged. But soon that smugness would shatter. The doors opened again, and the couple in designer coats stepped out, laughing lightly as the bellboy rushed to fetch their waiting car. The bellboy ignored David completely, not even a glance in his direction, as though he were invisible. Invisible. That word echoed in his mind. So often, black men of power were treated as if they were invisible until proven otherwise. He had built his company under the radar, preferring anonymity over celebrity. But here, invisibility had been forced on him, not chosen. And that was the mistake. David checked his watch. 2:53 p.m. The meeting had been scheduled for 3. His team was waiting. Soon, they would all walk in together. And when they did, no amount of smirking, no security guards, no polite discrimination would be able to erase the truth. The hum of the city continued around him. Still, in David's mind, everything narrowed to a single point. That marble lobby. The battlefield had already been chosen. He would not shout. He would not demand. He would return. And when he did, their own prejudice would be the blade they fell upon. Inside the hotel, the manager adjusted his cufflinks, smug in the belief that he had done his job well. He leaned toward the clerk, whispering, "You see? That's how you keep the place clean." The clerk smiled thinly, nodding, but outside, just beyond the glass, the man they had thrown out was planning the moment that would strip their arrogance bare in front of every guest, every staff member, and every chandelier that glittered above. And the clock was ticking. The crowd is reacting to the revelation. At 3 p.m. sharp, the revolving doors of the luxury hotel spun again. The chandeliers glowed brighter, and the echo of polished shoes against marble filled the lobby. Guests glanced up briefly, expecting another well-dressed patron, another customer who looked the part. But when David Cole walked in again, the air shifted. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him came 6 men and women in sleek business attire, his executive team. Carla, his assistant, strode confidently at his side, carrying a leather folder, embossed with gold lettering, Cole Enterprises Holdings Group. Each of them moved with the ease of people who belonged anywhere they went, and yet they followed him, their leader, without hesitation. The clerk at the desk stiffened. Her eyes widened as she recognized the man she had dismissed only minutes earlier. The smirk on her lips faltered. The floor manager, standing near the lounge entrance, turned sharply at the sight, his jaw tightening. He gestured subtly to security, as if preparing for another removal. But David didn't flinch. His stride was calm, controlled, every movement deliberate. He walked directly to the center of the lobby and stopped, his team fanning out behind him like a silent wall of authority. The guests nearby looked up from their laptops, curious. The couple who had watched his earlier humiliation leaned in from the lounge, whispering. The bellboy froze mid-step, the suitcase in his hand dangling awkwardly. The manager's voice carried across the marble. "Sir, we've already asked you to leave. You are not permitted." Carla cut him off, her voice sharp, professional. "You'll want to lower your tone?" The manager blinked. "Excuse me." David finally spoke, his voice calm, even, but carrying the weight of something undeniable. "You don't recognize me, and that's understandable. I never needed you to." The words hung in the air. Every staff member turned slightly, sensing a shift, but not yet understanding its meaning. David set his briefcase on the counter. With a quiet click, he opened it, revealing a stack of documents bound neatly in leather. He withdrew the first one and slid it across the counter to the clerk. Her trembling hands flipped the cover. Her eyes scanned the first page, and her face drained of color. She looked up at him, then back down, then up again, as though the paper were playing a trick. It wasn't. Close-up of the acquisition agreement. The heading read, Coal Enterprises Holdings Group. Acquisition Agreement. David turned his gaze to the manager, who was now visibly sweating. For the past 12 years, my company has acquired dozens of properties across this country. You may not know the name Coal Enterprises, but you're familiar with the buildings you work in. This hotel, he gestured around the gleaming lobby, is one of them. As of last year, every chandelier above you, every marble tile beneath your feet, every paycheck you hand out comes through me. A silence swept over the lobby. Even the fountains seemed to hush, their trickle subdued by the weight of his revelation. The manager stammered, his lips moving but no sound escaping. Finally he managed, "That can't be." David raised his hand, silencing him without effort. His eyes were steady, unflinching. "When you looked at me, you saw a man who didn't belong. When you heard my name, you heard something you thought was small. When you judged me by the color of my skin, you decided I was invisible. But the truth, Mr. Manager, is that you've been working for me all along." Gasps rippled through the bystanders. A woman seated in the lounge set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. One of the security guards shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his boss and David. The clerk swallowed hard, her face pale. She tried to speak. "Sir, I didn't mean—" David's voice cut through like steel wrapped in velvet. "You didn't mean?" "No. You meant exactly what you did. You meant to belittle. You meant to dismiss. You meant to strip me of dignity. Because in your eyes, a black man alone in a suit could not possibly own the ground he walked on. But here we are." Carla stepped forward, laying another document on the counter. "For your reference," she said crisply, "this is the corporate registry listing Mr. Cole as the principal shareholder of this property's holding group." The clerk didn't even pick it up. Her hands shook too violently. The manager tried to recover, straightening his jacket, forcing a weak smile. "Mr. Cole, if this is true, then surely we can—" David leaned closer, his voice dropping low, each word deliberate. "Stop. Please do not insult me further with your sudden politeness. Respect that arrives only after exposure is not respect at all. It is fear, and I have no use for fear." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the footsteps of guests crossing the lobby seemed to hesitate. All eyes were locked on him. This man who, moments ago, had been escorted out like an intruder, now stood revealed as the very owner of the empire they served. The power shift was complete. The invisible man was no longer invisible. He had become undeniable. David closed his briefcase with a snap and straightened, letting the weight of truth hang in the air. "I gave you a chance to treat me as a man before you knew my name. You failed. And now, we'll move forward on my terms." And with that, the stage was set for the reckoning to come. David and his team were in the lobby. The lobby was frozen in stunned silence. The chandeliers gleamed overhead, but their glitter suddenly seemed hollow, stripped of glamour. What had once been a fortress of exclusivity now felt fragile, vulnerable, because every person inside had just witnessed the unimaginable reversal of power. The manager swallowed hard, his face flushed with panic. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by beads of sweat at his hairline. Mr. Cole, if I may just explain. David lifted a hand, silencing him instantly. He didn't need to raise his voice. The authority in his quiet tone was enough. Explain? You mean justify? Tell me, how was dismissing me at the door a procedure? Tell me how the phrase, somewhere local, just slipped out of your mouth? Or perhaps you'll explain how your guards treated me like a trespasser, while others walked freely past without question. A murmur rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Guests shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, some looking guilty for not intervening earlier. The couple who had laughed at his humiliation earlier were now whispering frantically, realizing they had witnessed the mistreatment of the man who owned the building. David turned slowly, his voice carrying across the marble. Did anyone here hear how I was spoken to? Several guests nodded. A businessman near the lounge raised his hand. Yes, sir, I did. It was inappropriate. Inappropriate? David's calm laugh echoed off the walls. No, it was more than that. It was racism, dressed up in politeness, masked in procedure, but no less venomous. And it is the venom I've been fighting against my entire life. The clerk's eyes filled with tears. She stammered, Sir, I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you did, David said sharply, turning his gaze on her. You looked at my skin before you looked at my name. You judged my worth before you read a single line of my book. That was your choice, and choices have consequences. The guards shifted uneasily, no longer sure if they should stand at attention or melt into the shadows. Carla stepped forward, handing David another folder. He flipped it open with deliberate calm. This, he said, holding up the first page, is the termination authority I hold as principal shareholder. Effective immediately, I have the power to remove management personnel from their positions. The manager's knees seemed to weaken. Mr. Cole, please, let's discuss this privately. David shook his head. No. The humiliation I endured was not private. It was in full view of every guest, every staff member, and every pair of watching eyes. So the accountability will be just as public. A gasp swept across the room. Even the EE security guards leaned in slightly, as if waiting for the verdict. David locked eyes with the manager. You are dismissed. Effective immediately. The words struck like a gavel. The manager's mouth opened in shock. You can't. But Carla was already stepping forward, handing him an envelope. You'll find the paperwork inside. Your access card is deactivated as of this moment. The manager's face crumpled, his bravado shattered. He looked around the lobby, as if searching for someone to defend him, but no one moved. No one dared. David's gaze shifted to the clerk. Her hands trembled against the counter. And you, he said quietly, you taught me something today. That prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles politely while stabbing dignity. For that lesson, I have no further use for your service here. She covered her mouth, choking back a sob. The bellboy rushed to comfort her, but David raised a hand. Let her go. Accountability is not cruelty. It is justice. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Every guest, every staff member felt the weight of the reckoning. David turned to the guards. And as for you two, you followed orders. But let me be clear. You must never again put your hands on someone simply because your superior assumes they don't belong. If I see that again, your uniforms will be taken from you on the spot. Am I understood? Both guards nodded vigorously, their faces pale. David closed the folder and set it on the counter. He straightened, his voice carrying not just authority, but truth carved from years of survival. This hotel will not run on arrogance anymore. It will not run on exclusion. From this day forward, it will be a place where dignity is not questioned, where humanity is not filtered through skin color, and where power does not excuse prejudice. A smattering of applause began, hesitant at first, from a woman in the lounge. Then another guest joined in. Soon the sound grew louder, echoing against marble and glass, until the entire lobby vibrated with it. Guests stood, clapping not just for the man, but for the moment, for the justice they had seen unfold before their eyes. The former manager stood frozen, his termination envelope dangling in his hand. The clerk sobbed quietly, escorted away by another staff member. The guards lowered their eyes, chastened, and David Cole stood tall, not triumphant, but resolute. He had not needed to shout. He had not needed to threaten. He had only needed to reveal the truth and let the weight of their prejudice collapse upon itself. The invisible man had become undeniable, and the empire beneath their feet was his. David and his team are in the lounge. The applause slowly faded, leaving only the sound of the lobby fountain trickling behind David. He stood still, breathing deeply, his eyes scanning the faces around him. Guests, staff, strangers who had just witnessed both his humiliation and his redemption. But David didn't bask in the moment. This wasn't about pride, it was about principle. He turned toward his team, who stood silently behind him, their expressions fierce with loyalty. Carla gave a slight nod, her eyes glistening. She had watched him endure the sting of prejudice before, but never with such raw visibility. "Cancel the executive lounge," David said quietly to her. "We'll hold the meeting here." Carla blinked. Here? In the lobby? David's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Yes, right here. In the same place they tried to throw me out of. Let this be a reminder to everyone that we belong wherever we choose to stand." Carla's smile widened. She began directing the team, who swiftly set their laptops and folders on the lounge tables. Guests craned their necks, whispering as they realized what was happening. David approached a group of curious onlookers seated nearby. "If the commotion disturbed you earlier," he said gently, "I apologize, but sometimes justice makes noise before it makes peace." The woman who had started clapping earlier placed her hand over her chest. "Don't apologize, sir. We should be thanking you. That was unforgettable." David inclined his head in gratitude. Meanwhile, the staff moved uneasily. Some avoided his eyes, embarrassed by their silence during the incident. Others stared in quiet awe, realizing they worked for a man of immense power who had been treated like a trespasser. The former manager lingered by the entrance, pale and defeated, clutching his envelope. For the first time, his voice was stripped of arrogance. "Mr. Cole, I was wrong. Truly. Please reconsider. I have a family. This job—" David studied him for a long moment. He could hear the desperation in the man's voice, but he also remembered the smirk, the dismissiveness, the calculated cruelty of somewhere local. "Families should never suffer for arrogance," David said finally, "but neither should my people suffer the daily indignity of prejudice. You will leave this building today, but perhaps one day you'll remember this moment and treat the next man with dignity before you know his name." The manager lowered his eyes, nodding slowly. His silence was heavier than words. David then turned back to the lobby, raising his voice just enough to carry. This is not the first time racism has tried to diminish me, and I know it will not be the last. But I stand here to tell you, power is not measured in how loudly you shout. It is measured in how calmly you refuse to bow. Dignity is not given, it is claimed, and respect is not earned by wealth, but by humanity. The words lingered in the air like the final notes of a symphony. Several guests wiped their eyes. Even the guards, who had earlier flanked him with authority, now bowed their heads in respect. Carla signaled that the team was ready. The lounge, tables were set, the meeting prepared. David walked over and sat down, his team gathering around him. For the next hour, he conducted business in plain sight, his voice steady, his presence undeniable. By the time the meeting ended, the energy in the lobby had shifted entirely. Guests who passed by offered him nods of respect. Staff whispered his name with awe. Even the bellboy, who had ignored him earlier, stepped forward shyly with a tray of bottled water. "Mr. Cole," he said softly, I hope you'll accept this on the house." David accepted it with a warm smile. "Thank you. That means more than you know." David, looking out the window. When he finally rose to leave, the revolving doors opened once again, spilling the cold city air into the lobby. But this time, he didn't feel its sting. He walked out taller, his team at his side, his dignity intact. As the car door closed behind him, David gazed back at the gleaming facade of the hotel. He thought of his mother's words. "One day, when you have power, you won't just walk, you'll stand." And he had stood. Not just for himself, but for every black man and woman who had ever been told they didn't belong. For every child who had seen their parents humiliated. For every quiet injustice that had been swallowed in silence. The city lights flickered against the car window as the driver pulled away. David leaned back, his eyes calm, his mind steady. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just one battle in a lifelong war against prejudice. But today was a victory. And sometimes victories weren't measured in boardrooms or profits. Sometimes the most significant victory was standing tall when the world tried to push you down. David walks out of the hotel. When he finally rose to leave, the revolving doors opened once again, spilling the cold city air into the lobby. But this time, he didn't feel its sting. He walked out taller, his team at his side, his dignity intact. As the car door closed behind him, David gazed back at the gleaming facade of the hotel. He thought of his mother's words. "One day, when you have power, you won't just walk, you'll stand." And he had stood, not just for himself, but for every black man and woman who had ever been told they didn't belong. For every child who had seen their parents humiliated. For every quiet injustice that had been swallowed in silence. The city lights flickered against the car window as the driver pulled away. David leaned back, his eyes calm, his mind steady. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just one battle in a lifelong war against prejudice. But today was a victory. And sometimes victories weren't measured in boardrooms or profits. Sometimes the most significant victory was standing tall when the world tried to push you down. David accepts water from a bellhop. By the time the meeting ended, the energy in the lobby had shifted entirely. Guests who passed by offered him nods of respect. Staff whispered his name with awe. Even the bellboy, who had ignored him earlier, stepped forward shyly with a tray of bottled water. "Mr. Cole," he said softly, I hope you'll accept this on the house." David accepted it with a warm smile. "Thank you. That means more than you know." David, in the car. When he finally rose to leave, The revolving doors opened once again, spilling the cold city air into the lobby. But this time, he didn't feel its sting. He walked out taller, his team at his side, his dignity intact. As the car door closed behind him, David gazed back at the gleaming facade of the hotel. He thought of his mother's words. "One day, when you have power, you won't just walk, you'll stand." And he had stood, not just for himself, but for every black man and woman who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every child who had seen their parents humiliated, for every quiet injustice that had been swallowed in silence. The city lights flickered against the car window as the driver pulled away. David leaned back, his eyes calm, his mind steady. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just one battle in a lifelong war against prejudice. But today was a victory. And sometimes, victories weren't measured in boardrooms or profits. Sometimes, the most significant victory was standing tall when the world tried to push you down.